Have you ever done the right thing and gotten punished for it? Have you ever seen people who have done the wrong thing and they get a promotion? Have you ever seen that before? That's the world as we know it, right? And that's the world that we see here in the book of Esther. And that's why we need to see this. If you're joining with us online for the first time, I wanted to just give you a quick up to date of where we are in the book of Esther. Esther begins with this king who has a huge ego, and he says to his wife at this party, hey, come, I want you to appear before the rest of my subjects. And she says, no. And that begins the ball rolling for what God is going to do to rescue an entire nation. This is a nation of people who are living in a foreign land where they are the minority, where they are no longer the people who are on top. They are not in Israel anymore. They are in the land of Persia. And so they have to figure out how do they navigate through that. And last week we looked at this next passage where we see that a new queen is picked, and that queen is Esther. And that's where this passage now dovetails in. This is 5 years after she is chosen as the queen. Even after all the young women had been transferred to the second harem and Mordecai had become a palace official, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's directions just as she did when she arrived in his home. One day, as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthana and Teresh, who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, became angry at King Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot and gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the 2 men were impaled on a sharpened pole. This was all recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. So what you need to see in this passage, and I think in many ways, the trip that the Fikes family had yesterday, we went on the tail of the dragon. That was just something we did as a family together. And it seems like, I don't know how many curves it has. They 318 or something like that. It's in 11.2 miles.
But we only did half of it.
We only did half of it. So my math's not good enough. So we did lots of curves, but the point of all of this is, as you're on the dragon, you're like, where in the world are we? There comes a certain point where there's so many twists and turns that you're like, okay, where's Deal's Gap? Where's this restaurant that we were looking for where we want to eat? And that's kind of how it is with God's providence. But God's providence, Alistair Begg said it so well a few years ago. He said that the providence of God is really a rear view mirror thing. It's not a windshield thing. When you are in the midst of God's providence, you don't know it. And by the way, you're always in God's providence. You're always there, and you don't know what God's been doing or is going to do in your life until you get miles and miles and miles down the road. This is what God's providence looks like. And we see it played out here in the lives of 2 men who are very, very different. This author, he's going to introduce you to Mordecai, who's the protector, and he's going to introduce you to Haman, who's the persecutor. In the first 4 verses that we read there, in verses 19 through 23, we're reading about this guy, Mordecai. We read about him a little bit last week. Well, we're going to see a little bit more what his character is like. What kind of a man is Mordecai? We see in verse 19 that he's been made an official. Why? Well, because Esther's now the queen. She probably put him up for this promotion. And as he's an official, he's sitting in the gates of the city. Now, I don't want you to think some sort of chain-linked fence when you think of a gate here. Think about a huge gate that in terms of square footage is about 12,000 square feet. They've done archaeological digs, and they've found that's how big the gate was. It was 92 feet high, 130 some odd feet wide, and my calculator came out to something like 12,000 feet. I was like, man, that's huge. And that's just the face. That's not how deep it goes in. That's not talking. This was like a city hall. When you read something like in the city gates, it's not this tiny little place. This is a huge place, and Mordecai works there, and he finds out that these two guys, whose names are Bigthana and Teresh, they are two eunuchs who plan to assassinate King Xerxes. And next week, I'll give you another one of those Xerxes stories, just so you can see just how crazy this guy was, okay? And why he was one to either be assassinated or one to be afraid of. Is usually either one of the two. These eunuchs, for whatever reason, this bodyguard, they didn't like Xerxes, and they decided to assassinate him, and Mordecai finds out about it. In verse 22a, we read that Mordecai finds out, and he informs Esther. And Esther goes up the chain of command, and she tells her husband. Her husband then says, okay, let's have this investigated. And then in your translations, it might say that, and they were hung. In the New Living Translation, it gives you the unvarnished truth. They were impaled on a pike. That's what that means. They weren't the originators of this. They got this from the Assyrians, who lived several centuries before. That's how, when you hear that kind of phrase in either the context of an Assyrian or a Persian or a Babylonian, that's what you should think of when they talk about hanging someone. And so you're going to read in a few chapters later that Haman, he's going to have this huge gallows. It's a huge pike that he wants to impale his enemy on. And his enemy is this guy here, Mordecai. Mordecai, he gets a little bit of credit, right? Does he get he gets a promotion in this job, right? No, he doesn't get a promotion. He doesn't get a promotion at all. All he gets is mentioned in the local times, okay? This is something that will come back later, but right now, you should be thinking, if you're a Middle Eastern reader, you're expecting he's going to get a promotion. He's going to get a pay bump, and he gets nothing. And that should be a little bit jarring to you as an Old Testament reader. So I'm helping us understand how we would be taking this text if we're the original readers of this. But before we get there, just this whole idea of not getting credit. Moms, you may think you don't get credit for stuff. You sacrifice, and you get one day, and you get a card, right? Great. That's like being put in the Chronicles for King Xerxes. I want you to understand that God sees what you do, and the providence he is working out in your life. Right now, what you're seeing is the windshield. There's going to be something much bigger that you see in the rearview mirror. You're going to be seeing men and women that you rear, and God will be repaying every one of your efforts. Jesus teaches this. We also read this as well in places like 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Be steadfast and immovable in the work of the Lord. Because why? Because you know that your work in the Lord is not in vain. So I just wanted to encourage you to keep going and keep doing, because God's providence is seen in the rearview mirror and not in the windshield. Now, this king, he fails to mention Mordecai, to honor him in a right way. I mean, for goodness sake, this guy's life was just spared. And a similar sort of thing, a similar sort of assassination attempt will eventually get Xerxes a few years later. And so that's how big, there were two plots to kill Xerxes. The first one failed. This is the first one. The second one, it was successful. And that's when Artaxerxes became the emperor. But you can read that in your own personal time when you're reading ancient annals of the ancient Near East. So here in this passage, we go on to Esther chapter 3. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha. You say it really fast and no one can tell. Hammedatha, the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but he still refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, lots were cast in Haman's presence. The lots were called Purim, to determine the best day and month to take action. And the day selected was March 7th, nearly a year later. Then Haman approached King Xerxes and said, "There is a certain race of people scattered through all the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it is not in the king's interest to let them live. If it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury." The king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, "The money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit." Did you just see that? He just bought people. He bought them to kill them. Verse 12. So on April 17th, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Haman dictated. It was sent to the king's highest officers, the governors of the respective provinces, and the nobles of each province in their own scripts and languages. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all peoples, so that they would be ready to do their duty on the appointed day. At the king's command, the decree went out by swift messengers, and it was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa fell into confusion. So here, as we're looking at Haman, the persecutor, because that's what he is. We see several things, and I just would like to ask many of the, who, what, where, when, those typical question words. Let's start by asking, who is Haman? There's two ways that you can answer this. Number one, looking at what his vocation was. He was called the vizier, or he would be the equivalent of what we would think of a prime minister. He was Mr. Big, the guy in charge. He was second only to the king of the entire Persian Empire. Remember, that's from Pakistan all the way down to Sudan. So that's a huge swath of territory. Only Greece is the area where he can't get his hands on. More about that in just a few minutes. Okay, but you see who he is. He is Mr. Big. He is the prime minister. Now, here's the more important part: who he is in terms of his character. Okay, number one, Haman is an anti-Semite, straight up. In other words, as severe as this may sound, this man was a bigot. You can't really soft pedal it, because as you read this passage, this is not someone who just had who had a little difference with people. He wanted an entire race of people dead. He's calling for genocide that really is of a Nazi sort of order. In fact, he was the kind of person that the Nazis looked to in terms of how you're supposed to go about ruling the planet. That's what they're looking to. They're looking to king. They're looking to Haman, not king, but prime minister. So he's an anti-Semite. Secondly, Haman's name in Hebrew would be triggering something for you. His name sounds just like the Hebrew word for wrath. So when you hear Haman, you hear really mean, angry guy. Okay, so that's also another aspect of this story. And then thirdly, he's an Agagite. And I'm sure you're going to go home and tell all your friends about all the Agagites that you've met this week. Okay, what is an Agagite? Okay, let me start in Exodus chapter 17. Now, an Agagite, in shorthand terms, is another word for an Amalekite. Oh, great. You really helped me out, Bill, by telling me he's an Amalekite. They were Bedouins. They were the first ones who attacked Israel when they left Egypt. Okay, so that's who the Amalekites were. And we see that in Exodus chapter 17. And at that time, God spared them, but he said to Moses, I will take care of them later. I will destroy them for what they have done to you, or what they tried to do to you. The command comes in 1 Samuel chapter 15, where Saul is commanded to destroy the Amalekites. You may remember that scene. That's the place where Saul says, no, I'm not going to kill all the men, women, and children and all their stuff and put it up in one big bonfire. I'm going to keep the best stuff and make myself rich. And that really made God mad. That was the point at which he really lost his kingship as the king of Israel. And then when we read in Esther chapter 2, verse 5, you're going to read something about Mordecai. Mordecai is mentioned as the son of Kish. That's the same son as Saul. So what the author wants you to hear in their own Middle Eastern way of saying it is that Mordecai is a better Saul. He is going to do the things for Israel that Saul was supposed to do hundreds of years beforehand. So finally, the judgment of the Agagites, of the Amalekites, is going to come to rest. So he's an Agagite. He's a bad guy. And so they and the Jews, they always had bad blood with one another. And that's what all of this is about. This is Hatfields and McCoys, but with sandals. Okay, that's what this is, effectively. And so what does Haman do? He convinces Xerxes to kill all the Jews. Why does he do it? Well, because Mordecai doesn't want to bow down. Oh, and you're Jewish too. Okay, so that seals it. And then how does he do it? Well, through the most old-fashioned ways that anything happens. He lies about it, and then he bribes the king, right? That's what we see said here. He says that these people, they're strange. They don't follow, these people, they keep to themselves, and they don't ever follow your rules. This is one guy who does not follow the king's edict. And by the way, how great of a leader must he be if the king has to command everybody to show him honor? Have you thought about that? I mean, if your boss has to tell everybody in your workplace, hey, make sure you shake Bill's hand on the way in, then what kind of fragile ego does this guy named Bill have? Well, I can speak for all Bills. Yeah, pretty fragile. That's just sad, and yet that's what all of this genocide is going to be about the fact that this man doesn't get what he thinks is coming to him because Haman is a person who is infected with pride. In fact, we're going to find that pride becomes his undoing in the end. But there's so much to tell in this story. I can't get into all of it. Now, when does all of this take place? This is another part that's interesting, is that they roll the dice to figure this out. They just roll the dice, and that's what this is commemorating a festival called Purim. Now, in case you ever need this, in Hebrew, if you ever see something with the suffix "im" at the end, it's just the plural form of whatever that noun is. So Purim is 2 dice. So they throw the dice, and what is the day that it falls on? I mean, he basically a year later. And so it shows that even in the midst of rolling the dice, God is sovereignly keeping the dice from rolling the next day, or the next month, or 3 months from now. God is keeping them safe for an entire year. He buys them enough time, the Jews, so that they will be able to protect themselves. That's the long-range play of what we see going on here. But what's the day that this edict is written out, that we're going to kill all the Jews? The day that this edict is sent out is Passover. So if you're a Jew, and let's say that you're in one of the further reaches of the empire, you see and you look, oh wait, on Passover, the king decided he was going to commemorate us as a nation by sending us a letter that we're going to be destroyed. That Passover you just celebrated, is that the last one that I will ever know? Because me and everybody I know and everyone I hold dear will be dead. That is the kind of gravity that's going on. Or if you want to contextualize it to an American kind of situation, imagine if we had a president who said, I'm going to exterminate all the Christians, and he sends out that email on Easter. That's the kind of potency, that's the flavor that this passage has about it. So that's the lie that he tells. And then there's the bribe. In the New Living Translation, it said 10,000 large sacks of silver. That doesn't really quite gain. Again, you don't quite see. It's 10,000 talents. Oh, you really helped me out, Bill. I have a talent of silver with me right now. No, you don't. Because 10,000 talents of silver was 300 tons of silver. That's the promised price. Your eyes should be like saucers right now, guys. Okay, it's a huge amount of money. We're talking billions of dollars that are promised. Okay. Maybe you're still not impressed. Okay. Here's here's the amount of money the entire Persian government would bring in taxes in a year. 14,000. The entire Persian Empire would bring in 14,000. He's promising 70% of that. That's crazy money. That's absolutely crazy money. And so basically remember, Xerxes, he's a really bad general. Remember, he went on that fight against Greece, and he came back with nothing, and he depleted all the treasury. So now Xerxes hears, oh, wait, I get a second shot at Greece. That's what he hears. He hears, I get a second shot at that legacy. And then the king and Haman sat down to drink. That's how the story ends. We know that's not how the story ends. We know there's a lot more to the story, but that's a good stopping place. Because the contrast between these two men couldn't be more different. On the surface, it may seem that Haman is on the right side of history, as the old tired cliche goes. After all, he and the king are drinking buddies. But how does this look in the rearview mirror? With time and distance, we see that the only failure in this story would actually be a failure of courage on the part of the Jewish people. So we're going to start reading about courage in the next few weeks. These are times in Esther's life and in our time when you have to dig down deep and ask yourself, who do I really want to please? Whose approval really matters? Is it some Instagram influencer who I will never meet and who I really don't care about? Who do I really care about pleasing? Them or maybe someone else? Turn with me to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. That is what we see here in Moses' life. His life could have been one that was really, really comfortable. He could have had a really cool existence rather than having to go out and, run for his life or deal with 2 million Jewish people who are always yelling at him. Okay? It could have been a whole lot easier. But God has not called his people to a more popular or a more comfortable way. He calls us to the way of Jesus, one of courage and loyalty, not fear and manipulation. Because that's really, at the bottom line, that's what Haman is doing. He's manipulating a king who we've already seen is pretty easy to manipulate. I mean, throw some pretty girls and he turns to mush, Throw money at him, he turns to mush. Well, what does Jesus do for us? Jesus doesn't manipulate us. He's the one who comes and he frees us. He enriches us. He loves us. He loves us in ways that we can't fathom. And the thing is that we aren't alone as Christians. That we have fellowship with one another, that we have fellowship with the Spirit. We know that we have a destination, which is the joyful presence of our Heavenly Father. And as I was thinking about this idea of Haman being drinking buddies with Xerxes, in a sense, and I hope you're not offended by this, but we're kind of drinking buddies with Jesus. I mean, here's the Lord's Supper. We eat and we drink at a table with a king. We eat with a king who is pleased to call us his brothers. That is so much more than Haman would ever have. You have it without the manipulations, without threatenings, without the, without any of that. You get it. How? By saying, Jesus, I am a beggar who needs some bread. I am someone who is lonely, who needs an eternal friend. I am someone who has messed up in so many ways. I can't even count the number of ways that I've messed up. And he says, great, come to me. All you who are weary and heavy laden, come unto me and I will give you rest for your soul. This is the kind of Savior we have. One who comes to us, one who doesn't have to be manipulated, but he is the one who emptied himself of everything for us.